All you have to do to see God's power in the influence of Christianity is look back throughout history. We can go back and look at and say, this is the overwhelming, miraculous power of God upon people groups. It's just unbelievable in its positive attributes. You can see what belief system has power and which one doesn't with just a rational, basic comparison of human history.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Salty Pastor Podcast, a podcast designed to coach you up in your faith. Our goal is to give you accurate, unvarnished biblical truths so that you can think for yourself. The more you know, the more you can grow. My name is Jesse Mayer. I'll be your host, but we cannot do this without the one, the only, the Salty Pastor himself, Dr. Douglas Peak.
Hey, everyone. So good to be with you and the whole Salty crew. I'm loving it. If you could help us continue to expand our reach here by sharing this stuff with your friends and relatives and neighbors and everybody else, that's awesome. Another thing that really helps us is if you go to YouTube, look up the Salty Pastor channel and like and subscribe. Just like and subscribe. Even if you don't listen to it on YouTube, if you could just navigate there, it takes about 20 seconds and do that. What it really does is it pushes out the platform. So we're very excited about that. Also, if you want to support the Salty Pastor, you can go to the foothills.org website, and there's a little button up there that says give, and then you can scroll on where it goes. It'll say the Salty Pastor, and you can give through the website right there. Also, hopefully soon, the Salty Pastor website will be up and running, and then you'll be able to go directly to it and give.
Yeah, we're going to have some cool features where you can look up specific verses or topics and go back through the archives and find all those things, which will be a really cool feature. Are
we going to have any Salty Pastor swag on the website?
We are working on some merch, and I know I've been saying that for a long time, but I'm now married, and I have a desire to be more focused on merch. I don't have a wedding I'm planning, so I can do that.
Which is good. It's good to have you back.
Yes, I just got back from my honeymoon. I had a wonderful time. I'm
Sweet.
A little tanner. I spent a lot of time in the ocean, so I feel more salty, so I feel ready to come back to the Salty Pastor podcast.
I thought if you went on your honeymoon, you'd feel more relaxed and just,
I think I just took in
peace.
a lot of salt. Maybe that's what it is. I'm not feeling
okay.
salty.
You breathed in the salty air.
Yes.
Good for you.
Well, we are in the midst still of our honest conversation on mental health. I tuned in while I was gone, and I just loved what you were talking about last week. But we are moving on to a new topic this week. We're kind of in the depths of covering some of the biggest mental health issues plaguing us today. And this week we're focusing on stress and burnout. And I think people don't necessarily always identify this as a mental health issue, right? I think it's easy to be like, well, I don't have mental health issues. I don't have depression. I don't have anxiety. I don't have suicidal thoughts. I don't have some sort of clinical treatment.
Correct.
But I am stressed sometimes, and I don't really want to work anymore. Like, that's really stressful, and that's getting people don't necessarily always qualify that as a mental health struggle, but it is, and we're going to talk about it today.
Yeah, I think it's a big deal, and just to give you a little context, and that is that when my father, I was growing up, and I was in high school. My father was treating these women. He was a pediatric endocrinologist, and he was treating these women. And it was really interesting because these women had gotten, they weren't in very good shape at all. And so they were worried about whether or not they could have kids because they weren't menstruating and these types of things. And so he says, well, you got to exercise. You got to start exercising. And back then, running became a big deal, Everybody started to get into the running thing. And so a couple of these ladies started to run, and then they go, I want to do a half marathon. Then I want to do a full marathon. And then one lady wanted to do an ultra marathon,
What is an ultra marathon?
Well, it's like 2 marathons back to back.
Ooh.
And then there's one now that you can do. It's 100 miles. It's almost like 4 marathons back to back to back. You just run for, days.
Ever.
It's
just
crazy.
Forever.
But what was really interesting is when they started to get in shape, guess what happened? They got healthier. They got a lot more regular in their cycles. They felt better. But then something else happened that people had never really known before is they were overtraining and they were pushing themselves so hard. So guess what happened? They stopped having cycles. They stopped And what happened is they realized, wow, you've done too much, and now you're tearing your body down. In the same way, that's what stress is. On the one hand, you want to challenge yourself. You want to grow, push yourself, because that keeps you spiritually and emotionally and intellectually vibrant. You're using your brain. You're using your heart. You're making effort, right?
Right. Very
You're
similar to
not
workouts. You need to stress your body enough to grow.
Yeah, you're not an emotional flabby couch potato, or an intellectual flabby couch potato. You're using this stuff to grow. However, you can push yourself too hard, and that's stress. Okay. Now, that's not the only way you experience stress, but you can experience stress in other ways. And what happens is if you stress too long, too much, that can push you into burnout.
Okay.
And burnout is the problem. Okay. Now, there's major influences over where your window of, I need to push myself and be healthy, to I'm overstressed and falling into burnout. It has to do with your
where
biology.
That healthy window is.
Yeah. Your biology determines where your healthy window is, right? Some people are more prone to stress than others. And some people are more prone to stress in different arenas than they are in other arenas, right? Your personality has a lot to do with it too. Some people just have a real, easygoing, unflappable personality, and other people are what I call high strung, right? You know what I mean? They're kind of like nervous, and they're just more stressed out over little things.
You can just call me out if that's all if you're trying to walk around.
No, I'm not trying to call you out. I'm just saying there's some people that way. The other thing that is a really big influencer on your healthy window of, am I pushing myself to grow, or am I overly stressed and pushing myself towards burnout, is how you were raised, your upbringing, how it was modeled, whether you actually deal with stress when you start pushing yourself or you're under stress. Now, you can also get stressed through traumatic events. You can get stressed through surprises and radical changes in your life that weren't planned. Stress comes from all kinds of things, but your modeling of how to deal with problems and stress makes a big influence on how you deal with it and whether it can push you into burnout. So what is the truth, though, that we can all say applies to all of us? Well, everyone responds to stress differently. Stress impacts everyone differently, but the axiomatic truth, meaning the one standard across the board, is that continued stress over a long period of time can lead to burnout. So I think one of the best things we could do is dig into an Old Testament story about Elijah, and it's found in 1 Kings. It starts back in kind of chapter 17 and 18, but it kind of culminates in chapter 19.
Okay.
And before, I was going to have you read it, and I'll comment on it, but before we do that, I just want to give you a little bit of background, okay? And that is the highlight of Israel as a nation under King David and King Solomon is gone, okay? And what has happened is Israel is split into two kingdoms. You have a southern kingdom called the Kingdom of Judah, and that's, Jerusalem is in Judah. And then you have the northern kingdom, which is Israel. Israel had turned away from God sooner, okay? And as a matter of fact, it collapsed, or it was taken over by the Assyrians in 721. Now, Judah stayed a standalone kingdom all the way up to about 580 something, so 570, so about another 135 years before the Babylonians came in and took it over. And that's when Daniel was taken back, and that's where this book of Daniel kind of takes place. So just to give everybody kind of a little bit of reference, okay? Now, what is so interesting is that the northern kingdom saw their decline, and they were told over and over again by prophets about their decline, but they didn't listen.
Okay.
They just stayed in the decline path, and they've collapsed as a nation. And the northern kingdom has never existed since then. See, so it's really quite fascinating. Now, one of the people that was just over the top, leading him in the wrong way, was a king by the name of Ahab. Okay? This isn't the pirate or the sailor. I was going to say,
this isn't the Moby Dick one.
Yes, not the Moby Dick guy. This is much earlier. This is Ahab, and he was a king. And what he did is he married a woman by the name of Jezebel. Now, up to this point, Jezebel was an attractive, nice name. Today, in our culture, when you call somebody a Jezebel, it is derogatory.
It does not have a good connotation
this
attached
is
to
the
it.
woman who gave Jezebel a bad name, okay?
She ruined the name for everybody.
She ruined the name for everybody. Well, what happened is she was a Sidionite, and the Sidionite was from Phoenicia, which you had the Philistines were coastal people.
Okay.
And the biggest thing about the Philistines and why they were so bad and the Phoenicians were so bad is because they worshipped the pagan gods Baal and kind of his counterpart, which is Asherah. And basically what they were is they were a fertility or a sex cult. And what they did is they sexually trafficked their children. They sexually molested children. They sexualized children very young. And the other thing they did is to make sure that they could be fruitful, they would sacrifice their children. So they killed their own children. And so it comes out of another demonic god called Molech. There's a whole bunch of history behind this. I won't dig into all of that. But they were pretty disgusting. So what happened is Jezebel married Ahab, and then Ahab pursued this with abandon, okay? And what Jezebel did is she killed all the prophets of Israel, right? And replaced them with prophets of Baal and Asherah. And so the only prophet that's kind of left around was Elijah. And Elijah's been on the run. So I thought that you might want to start there in chapter 18. So
yeah, with that context, let's get into it, and we'll just kind of dissect it as we go. Now, starting in verse 17. Now Elijah, the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall certainly be neither dew nor rain during these years, except by my word." So talk to me a little bit about this. We're obviously jumping into the middle of a conversation, so you want to shed some light on that?
Yeah, and well, what's interesting is that he wasn't like in front of him, like they're having this dialogue, but they
weren't yelling at each other across the mountain.
Across the mountaintops, but he made a pronouncement. Elijah is the prophet of God, and he says, "Because you have been so corrupt and you've pursued these other gods, and it's not that you're just doing it. It's one thing if you're just doing it, but what he did is he led the entire nation of Israel.
Yeah, he replaced all the prophets, and now it's basically
telling people everybody's got to do this and leading them in that direction. So basically what Elijah says, you know what? God has told me that he's removing his protective covering, and so you're not going to have any rain. So a drought happens, and it was devastating because it creates famine. People are starving to death.
All right, so at this point, I'm assuming Ahab doesn't just let this go, right?
Well, no, he puts a bounty out on Elijah's head. Okay. But Elijah, you kind of read, God says, go here. So he runs out into the desert. And I mean, you got to realize where he's going is like not down around the block.
He's a fugitive.
He's a fugitive.
He's
so
most wanted.
Yeah, he leaves. He goes like 100 miles into the deep desert in Jordan. And then he goes 150 miles up north, by sight. And then he comes back, so we're up around the region of the Sea of Galilee, where eventually all this happens, the confrontation at Mount Carmel.
Okay. So when Ahab saw Elijah, we're in verse 17, Ahab said to him, "Is this you, the cause of the disaster to Israel?" He said, "I have not brought disaster to Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed Baals. Now then, send orders and gather to me Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table."
Let me tell you what's going on. So Ahab was searching because he was like, man, this is Elijah's fault.
Right.
And if I can find Elijah, I'm going to kill him, and then it'll end the drought. And Elijah goes, it's not me.
Right.
It's God. And he says, I'm not the one who caused this problem, this disaster. You did because of what you did. Notice what he says, 400 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. That's 800 prophets.
Right.
So these kingdoms at that time were not, these like massive population bases, right? So it shows you how much they'd gotten rid of all of the priests of Israel, right, and replaced them. So it also shows us how corrupt it was, because Baal and Asherah are the male and female pagan deities that come out of the demonic influence of Molech. And so it was a fertility cult. They did, as I said earlier, this was really nasty stuff. It's pretty disgusting.
Well, let's keep reading. So verse 20 picks up. So Ahab sent orders among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Then Elijah approached all the people and said, how long are you going to struggle with the two choices? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is, follow him. But the people did not answer him so much as a word. Then Elijah said to the people, I alone am left as the prophet of the Lord, while Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now have them give us 2 oxen and have them choose the 1 ox for themselves and cut it up and place it on the wood. But put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox and lay it on wood, and I will put no fire under it. Then you call to the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people replied, that is a good idea.
So what's really interesting here is basically what Elijah does, he challenges Ahab to a duel, right? And what he does is he says,
spiritual showdown.
It's a spiritual showdown. And notice that it's not about Ahab. It's about the people, because he says, how long will you struggle with 2 choices? You got to do one or the other. And it says the people said not a word. And so Elijah goes, I stand alone. I stand alone. He goes, so this is what we're going to do, is we're going to issue this duel. We're going to see whose God is a God of power. And what's really fascinating about this is kind of a side note, in that one reason that we don't see God, consuming altars with oxen on them anymore is because this, of course, is in the Old Testament under the Old Covenant. Now we're under the New Covenant. But also another reason is just pretty pragmatic, and that is God did this over and over and over again. I mean, there were all these incredible manifestations of power. I've talked to people before who said, well, if God just showed up in the sky, I'd believe in him. And I said, no, you won't. No, you won't. Because I have a record of people of Israel who saw a pillar of fire, the parting of the Red Sea, the 180,000 Assyrians killed by or wiped out by 300 people following Gideon. You've seen miracle after miracle after miracle. And guess what?
You always
go your own way. So I think what's interesting is he's just saying, in this case, we have to determine who has the power. And all you have to do to see God's power in the influence of Christianity is look back throughout history. We have a record now that we can go back and look at and say, this is the overwhelming, miraculous power of God upon people groups. It's just unbelievable in its positive attributes. And so you can see what belief system has power and which one doesn't with just a rational, basic comparison of human history. So, but back to this story is that you can see this duel and you can see what he does. He sets it up. So let's keep going.
So verse 25 picks up. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose the 1 ox for yourself and prepare it first, since there are so many of you, and call on the name of your God and put no fire under the ox. Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it, and they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, no one answered. And they jumped around at the altar which they had made. And at noon, Elijah ridiculed them and said, call out with a loud voice, since he is a god, undoubtedly he is attending to business, or is on the way, or is on a journey. Perhaps he is asleep and will awaken. So they cried out with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until blood gushed out of them. When midday was past, they raved until the time of offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention.
Don't you love Elijah? Man.
He's getting sassy.
Oh, he is gangster right here. He's just like, well, maybe he's on a journey. Maybe he fell asleep. Maybe he did this.
Pretty being so outnumbered, he's feeling pretty confident.
He's won. Yeah, there's 450 men, and that is count. The priestesses of Asherah were females, so we don't even get their count. But anyway, what's so fascinating about it is that. Notice what it says. They cut themselves with swords and lances until blood gushed out. This just gives you an idea of what their belief system was based on and why they sacrificed children and why they sexualized things to such a perverted state. And so, but Elijah is gangster, man. He's mocking them and no one answers. It's kind of today, I guess, the thing that I really like is the Babylon Bee, because they just mock the stupidity of people.
Yes.
And I don't know, maybe I shouldn't enjoy that, but I do.
Well, let's continue on. Verse 30 picks up and says, Then Elijah said to all the people, Come forward to me. So all the people came forward to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Then Elijah took 12 stones, corresponding to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. And then with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar, large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. Then he laid out the wood, and he cut the ox in pieces and placed it on the wood. And he said, Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And he said, Do it a second time. So they did it a second time. Then he said, Do it a third time. So they did it a third time, and the water flowed around the altar, and it also filled the trench with water.
Okay, he's getting super gangster here, because he basically, he says, okay, this is God, the 12 tribes. And what's interesting is he's going back to the original context in which the covenant was given, right? He said, okay, your name will be Israel. And if you go back further, you realize that he changed the name of, there was Esau and Jacob, and he says, you'll now be my people. Israel. And then he had 12 sons, right? Of course, not directly, but because 2 were through Joseph.
Right.
And what happened is it ended up basically, then he drenches this thing. He builds a big trench around it, and he just soaks it with water.
He's on him at this point. He's basically just...
He is over the top.
Yes.
So let's see what happens.
So then at verse 36, then at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet approached and said, Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are the God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you, Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell on their face, and they said, The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Then Elijah said to them, Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape. So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook of Kishon.
Yep.
And slaughtered them there. I was there when I was in Israel. We went to Mount Carmel.
There you go. Yeah. So you can see it's about 15 miles off the coast, Yes. And if it's kind of really, really clear, you can see the ocean. If you look west, but you could look east and you can see Mount Horeb. You see that huge valley down there. It's really, it's a great place to go and be. So I think what's really interesting is we have this massive confrontation, a tremendous victory, to the point where, in essence, he lures all the prophets of Baal, all the priestesses of Asherah out, and all the people of Israel in the northern kingdom see this. They see who God is, and then they say, okay, we're going to purge this evil from our midst, right? And so they go and they kill all the prophets. So Elijah stands alone, but then he ends up being the only one left standing.
Right.
Right?
Well,
and so
I've got a question, though, Pastor. This is a great story, but I thought we were talking about burnout and stress.
Yeah, because let me ask you this question. He has this huge victory. He does all this stuff. How do you think he would feel? How would you feel if you just did a slam dunk?
You'd be doing a happy dance. You'd be doing all kinds of partying. He just stunted on these guys so hard. And
God showed up. There's no doubt. Because you would think at this point it would say, and they lived happily ever after, right? But that's not what happened.
This is the epic climax of the movie, and then
read the next verses.
Yes.
Read the next verses.
1 Kings 19:19. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah and said, So may the gods do to me, and more so, if by about this time tomorrow I do not make your life like the life of one of them.
So she threatens to murder him.
Yes. And he was afraid, and he got up and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. And then he left his servants there. But then he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked for himself to die and said, Enough, Now, Lord, take my life. I am no better than my father's.
Now that's some victory dance, isn't it?
Yeah, that's pretty depressing.
So if you were to map that out where Beersheba is, and where Mount Carmel is, it's 200 kilometers. So if you were to walk it, it would take you, I think, 72 hours of nonstop walking.
But he ran this, didn't he?
Yeah, he was scared witless.
Yeah.
So isn't that interesting? And so he does all of this. The victory, he's emotionally drained, and then she threatens to kill him. And so he flees all the way to Judah. So he crosses from the northern kingdom into the southern kingdom,
Right.
which those didn't get along. They're at war with each other. And so what happens is he flees away, and then he takes kind of a turn he's going south. Then he goes east out into the Jordanian desert, right, as far as he can get from any civilization. And he basically sits down and he says to God, I'm done. It's worse than I could ever imagine. I'm no better than my fathers. So let's see what God does. Because what we're seeing here, I think, is with his fear, his exhaustion, is we're seeing the signs of burnout, even after a great victory.
Yeah, because usually, I'm sure we'll talk about this more on Thursday, even when you're doing something amazing and you have a great, powerful, you're turning huge profits, or whatever your job might be, or whatever your passion or hobby is.
Yes.
Even that can't sustain you forever, right? And so he basically gets burnt out.
Yes.
And then I guess let's see what God
Exactly.
does.
Oh, you've pulled the analogy out. Stress and burnout are not only a result of, overextending ourselves in wrong ways, or doing bad things, or, living outside of our own, we're violating our own conscience and doing things we shouldn't be doing. It also can be a result of doing some of the best things.
Yes.
With the greatest victories. But if we're not careful, we fall into burnout, just like Elijah. So what did God do?
So verse 5 of chapter 19, then he lay down and fell asleep under a broom tree, but behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said, arise and eat. And he looked and beheld, and there was at his head a round loaf of bread baked on hot coals and a pitcher of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. But the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too long for you. So he arose and ate and drank, and he journeyed in that strength of the food that for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God.
So isn't that interesting? I don't want to gloss over this. Oftentimes, we always stop preaching or teaching on this story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal when he slam dunks on them.
Right.
Right.
You leave on the victory.
We live
the
on the
closing
victory.
Credits roll, and it's good to go.
Let's not talk about the after party. Because the after party, he's burned out, he's fried, he's running for his life, and he's scared. And what's interesting is that, notice what he does, is he says, first thing is you must sleep. He says, just lay down and sleep. And then an angel touches him and says, now you need to get up and eat. Some of the things, when you get burned out, some of the things is that you need to re-engage in the rhythms of physical health. And that is, you need to sleep and you need to nourish your body, right? So do those things first. Let's just sleep and eat. And then he says, I need you to get up and I need you to go to the mountain of God. What happens is our spirit can be drained emotionally, and there's only one way to fulfill it, and that is to go back to the source, which is God. I liken it to this. Burnout happens and can happen quickly in a person's life. It's like a car battery. That is that if I were to go out into the parking lot right now and I turned on your radio, without starting the car, I turned on your radio and your lights and everything, in an hour and a half, your car wouldn't start because your battery's dead, right? Well, in order for that battery to get healthy again, you got to take it home and put on a trickle charger. So it takes an hour and a half to drain it. It takes 14 hours to recharge it through a trickle. And that's kind of what happens is when we start to experience burnout, when the stress is too much and we're breaking down, is that we have to return to the place that can revitalize us. But it's not a shock. And we'll talk about this on Thursdays, that a lot of times people who are burned out, people who are fried,
They just want to jumpstart it.
They want to jumpstart themselves spiritually. And so that's why they turn and they do dumb things, right? And you're like, man, I knew this person. They're so solid. They did something stupid, or what an error in judgment. And you go, you don't really realize they're trying to jumpstart their hearts. So we have to have understanding in that, and then help people come back to the mountain of God, the source of what revitalizes us. But we can't go back to God until we take care of the physical needs first. Remember how we talked about the 4 buckets and all this?
Yeah.
And that is, even though all things are influenced and ultimately go back to the spiritual, we can't ignore the other buckets.
Right.
We've really got to be able to address them all. If we do that, then we know for a fact that we really care for people at every level.
In a holistic manner.
Yeah, remember when we started this whole series, we talked about the passage in John and the passage in James, like the half-brother of Jesus, James, where he says, what good is it to tell a person who is,
Hungry
cold
or
and hungry and cold, be warm and filled, but don't do anything to help them? What
Right.
good is that? And then John says, let us not love in word and tongue, but let us love in deed and truth.
Yes.
So to get to the spiritual, we often have to love in deed and in truth. And that means people struggling with mental health issues, we need to address the biological bucket, the clinical bucket, the situational bucket in order to fill the spiritual bucket.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for diving into the story with us today, Pastor. Excited to be back. I'm excited to be talking about this. And I think this is one of the ones that's easiest to overlook when it comes to our mental health, but probably the one that the most people will experience at any given point in their, at some point in their life, more than likely, because just the way and the rhythm of our world these days is so prone to that, especially here. I mean, this is a great time, we'll talk about this more on Thursday, but the rhythm on the island, I went to Maui for my honeymoon, is very different than the rhythm here, right? And there could be something to take away from that. So we'll have to talk about more of that on Thursday. But until then, we hope you guys have a blessed day, and we'll see you on Thursday here on the Salty Pastor Podcast.
Blessings.